Yeah, thanks for having me back again, and particular thanks to Dr. Mary Mills for the invitation. This is a talk which was first brought about for the Royal Arsenal Woolwich Historical Society before we wound it up. And it was in fact the last talk that the Society ever had. It's a talk about the Arsenal's unknown outstation, the Yantlet Creek Gunnery testing station. And during the interwar period, this was one of the most important military facilities in this country. And I'm going to try and explain that to you, why it was so important. And asking around the former Royal Arsenal Woolwich Historical Society, it turned out not very few, one person in that society, formed almost entirely out of people who worked in the Arsenal, had even heard of this place. So I thought I'd better do a pretty comprehensive historical introduction to give an indication just why this was so important. So you will be getting quite a lot of general history this evening, and also, of course, it isn't largely in the former metropolitan boroughs of Deptford, Greenwich or Woolwich. But never mind, let's treat it as a holiday. The story for me starts off in the early 1970s when I bought this map. Other children bought comics with their money, and I bought Ordnance Survey maps. Obviously, as you can see, I really am a boring old fart, and I was even then. It's called Chatham and Maidstone. It's a terrific map. It's one of the best you can get, in fact, even today. There are tremendously varied amounts of topography and topology and land use and whatever on it. It's absolutely fascinating, lovely bit of cartography. I pored over every grid square and made my way up every railway line, and realised that one of the railways didn't go anywhere. Now, generally, people don't build railways to nowhere because they're expensive, so there must be a reason. I didn't at that time know the reason why there wasn't anything at the end of it, because of course it was ministry land, and the Chatham Dockyard is just a white space on that map. That spurred my intrigue into this particular site, and I made my first site visit in around about 1978, only to find that it was ministry land and I couldn't get in. And I did see the buildings from the other side of the river. I remained enthused about it, and then, in the very, very early days of the World Wide Web, Kent County Council digitised this. It's the first photograph I'd ever seen of the area. Now, some of you have already recognised this as a photograph of Allhallows-on-Sea railway station, and that's what it really is. There we are, the Southern Railway's new railway station, not built until 1933, and hopefully going to be a rival to Southend, which is on the other side of the Thames. This is the River Thames. Now, I would think, if I had time, I would read the Southern Railway's minutes for that time, because anybody who wanted to build a holiday resort here must have been out of their mind. And I suspect that the Southern Railway's board had only ever visited this area on a map. If you went there in person, you wouldn't have poured any money into it, I can assure you. But that's not what I was looking for. I was looking up to this area here. That is the site of what we're going to talk about now, or what I'm going to talk about now. You might notice some little spikes, tiny little spikes poking up, and they intrigued me even more. It wasn't long after before I did finally find out what it was all about, and through in more recent years my researches concerning the Royal Arsenal have brought about a little further knowledge. Not long after I had made a second site visit in 2006 with Ministry of Defence permission, and gone over the entire site very carefully with the assistance of the range warden. English Heritage turned up, and with professional archaeologists, and turned out a 44-page report on it. Now, by that time I had already compiled various missives on the internet, and was about to have a magazine article published Well, English heritage blew that out of the water. But of course we did come to exactly the same conclusions, because there's only one set of conclusions to draw. If you want to read the English Heritage Report, look up Yantlet firing point on the internet and you will be able to download 44 pages about this, but it won't tell you much more than what I'm going to tell you now. I don't think it will. Right, anyway, nice photograph though. Here's the 100 of Who down here, Isle of Sheppey over there, and you can just see there the outline of a very large warship, presumably waiting for attention at Chatham Dockyard. Right, to understand why this place was so important, we need to do a little bit of fairly old history. We're going to go back to 1805, and here is Europe at that time. The big players, of course, are Spain, France and Britain. The countries that we can ignore, perhaps surprisingly, are Portugal, because Britain was in alliance with Portugal and had been for hundreds of years and still is. They are our oldest ally. And Russia, because Russia is just slightly outside of the sphere of this. We will get one mention of Russia later on, but not very much. What's perhaps more important is what isn't on this map. You might notice that there is no Germany. You might notice that there is no Italy and there is no Belgium. Until recently there wasn't a Denmark or a Norway either. They were all part of the Swedish Empire, but the Swedes had decided to withdraw from imperialism and concentrate on their own country. Britain, France and Spain, meanwhile, were very, very enthusiastic about imperialism indeed. And this is what these three countries were really all about. We'll do Spain first. The country is as rich as Croesus. It owns most of South America. In fact, except for Brazil, it owns almost all of it. It owns all of Central America, a very large number of islands in the Caribbean, and its influence extends right up into what would now be the northern parts of California, and indeed halfway up in Wyoming. It's got a very, very considerable overseas empire. It's very wealthy. It is awash with precious metals coming from South America, particularly Bolivia, and these are brought in armadas every year over to Spain, and they have more gold and silver than what you could ever imagine. And it was a fully developed empire by that time. By 1805, it's got a proper bureaucracy, it's got proper management, very highly developed. France has also got major imperial concerns in Canada. It is trying to take over a large part of India, and it has succeeded in taking over Egypt. Britain, as you will already know, has just lost its best colonies in the United States, what's become the United States of America. It is determined not to lose any more. And for that reason, the majority of Britain's army is in Canada and India to fight off the French. We are at war with France at this time. It's the Napoleonic War. In fact, we'd been at war with France for a very, very, very long time, for various different reasons. If you look up the word War of Coalition, you will find out about those wars. And then you will see on the internet, War of Coalition number 1, War of Coalition number 2, number 3, number 4. Britain paid for all these wars, but it was actually people like Austria-Hungary who were fighting them quite frequently. We did not get on well with France, and hadn't done for a long time. We certainly weren't going to get along with Napoleon Bonaparte, because he wanted to invade us. He was in alliance with Spain in 1805, and the Spanish and the French realised that this was the time to invade Great Britain, because our armed forces were overseas. We couldn't defend ourselves. Britain was reliant at this time on a poorly trained and poorly armed militia. It's people with blunderbusses and pitchforks and that sort of thing. It would have been very, very easy for Napoleon's forces to have crossed the English Channel. They actually began to build the invasion barges and take this country over. They wouldn't have lost. They couldn't have lost. The only thing that stood in the way was the Royal Navy. Had that invasion taken place, The barges would have been towed across the channel by a sailing ship and rowed the last part of the way. It would have been easy meat for the Royal Navy. They would have destroyed such a force. Therefore, before the invasion can take place, the Royal Navy itself has to be destroyed. The French and the Spanish individually do not have the navies to do that. So they decide to amalgamate their navies and to jointly sail into the English Channel, and the Royal Navy will be forced to come out of Portsmouth and wherever, because the alternative is certain invasion. And by sheer weight of numbers, the Spanish and the French are hopeful that they will destroy the Royal Navy. And theoretically, on paper, so they should. They've got greater numbers. But they hadn't got Vice Admiral Lord Nelson, who had different ideas. And instead of waiting for them to sail into the Channel, he sailed the British fleet all the way around here to where they were coalescing, a place called Cape Trafalgar. You know what happened next. I don't think Britain really realised the day after Trafalgar that it had suddenly become the most powerful country in the world. And it had, because the Royal Navy now had no real competition from anybody. The only likely competition would be from the Russian Navy and from the Navy of the fledgling United States of America. Britain could now do pretty much what it wanted. The situation in France and Spain got even more interesting. France and Spain fell out with one another. Napoleon decided to invade Spain and Portugal. Britain has got an alliance with Portugal. Britain invades Spain. Spain falls out with Napoleon. Britain and Spain fight Napoleon. The Peninsular Wars, on and on and on and on. The whole area is an absolute cauldron of belligerents, one into the other. Britain, meanwhile, with dominance of the seas, can get on with building its empire. As we all know, that it did very, very well indeed. As that empire began to grow, in this country we of course had the Industrial Revolution. There were very considerable differences made in this country by that. People left the farmlands to go and work in the factories because the pay was better. There was agricultural depopulation. There was urban overpopulation. And Britain started to find it easier and easier and easier to import its food from the colonies rather than growing it ourselves. And the colonies found it very much easier to import manufactured goods from the United Kingdom than anywhere else. The result is that through the earlier part of the 19th century, Britain is a country that becomes absolutely dependent upon international trade, seaborne trade. It's the only way. The country's economy, the country's security, everything is dependent upon seaborne trade. And to look after that, Britain begins to realise that it has to develop its navy. It already has the most powerful navy in the world, and now it will go further and further and further. There's just one little aberration. In 1812, Britain decides, after a few disputes with the United States of America, to invade the United States of America from Canada. The result was an absolute success. The Americans were routed and the British were marching on New York before the order came to retreat back to Canada. But during that campaign, the War of 1812, the Royal Navy actually suffered a defeat at the hands of the American Navy in the Great Lakes. Now, that was the last time that the Royal Navy was defeated for a very, very long time. And the British were quite determined that there wouldn't be any opportunity for it to be repeated for a very, very long time. So from about 1815 onwards, the investment in the Royal Navy began to increase and increase and increase and increase. It would become by far the world's largest navy. It would become the dominant force in the world of trade. Nobody could have traded anywhere in the world if the Royal Navy had wanted to have stopped it. It was a tremendously powerful force and we needed it. it is essential to realise that by, say, the middle of the 19th century, Britain was utterly dependent on international trade for its existence. And that is the key to why Yantlet Gunnery Testing Station was so important. Meanwhile, what's happening in this hodgepodge of countries here? Let's move on to 1870. And this is roughly what Germany looked like in 1870, but it's not a political map, it's an economical map. This doesn't show the dozens of little palatinates and principalities that make up northern Germany. They're all independent nations. What this shows is the various customs unions between them. If I wasn't showing the customs unions and just the individual countries, this would be looking like a patchwork quilt. Dozens of little countries all over the place. Some of them very, very old. By far the largest country in what would become Germany is Prussia. A country which had been eyed jealously over the centuries by both Russia and Austria-Hungary, because Prussia has got the North German plain, and this is rather a good place to grow wheat. Russia, Austria-Hungary had all been fought off over a very, very long period of time. The Prussians had suffered a serious defeat at Austerlitz at the hands of Napoleon, but nonetheless, with Napoleon gone, Prussia had recovered its pride and had now become the dominant country in the northern area of Germany. 1870, July 1870, Napoleon III decides that he would quite like to invade Germany. He's been given a little bit of a boost because the Chancellor of Germany, Otto von Bismarck, has doctored a telegram which gives an indication to Napoleon III that the Germans have been very rude to one of his ambassadors. This is licence to Napoleon III to start an invasion. In this area here, he's going to attack Baden, Rhenish Bavaria, and a tiny little bit of Prussia, detached. He started that invasion in July 1870, and by September 1870, the Prussians had besieged Paris. The French were absolutely routed in this war, the Franco-Prussian War. Bismarck knew he was going to win, and that's why he invited Napoleon III to start the war. As a result, there was a slight adjustment. This area here, Alsace-Lorraine, part of France, is ceded to these people up here, the Northern Germans. But they won't be Northern Germans for long, they will just be Germans. Because as a result of that invasion, Bismarck got exactly what he wanted. And the Kaiser of Prussia, Wilhelm I, got exactly what he wanted. The small countries all over here realised that they really weren't powerful enough to resist an invasion from France, probably anybody else. They had all to be one nation. And that new nation was proclaimed by Bismarck in 1871. It was Imperial Germany. This was a new superpower in the middle of Europe. Britain looked on with some appreciation, even approval. Good reasons for that. Because to the east, you've got Prussia, you've got Russia. And to the west, you've got France. Now, the British Empire only really had two threats to it. They were the French in Africa and the Russians coming through Afghanistan and attacking India. Now, with this very powerful, new, aggressive neighbour, France and Russia would think twice about attacking the British Empire. There might be more important things to do at home. Furthermore, Britain and Prussia had good reason, Britain and Imperial Germany had good reasons to be getting on with one another. For a start, very strong blood ties in the royal family. There are very strong industrial ties as well. As the 19th century progressed, you will know about the establishment of Siemens in Charlton, which is one very good example. But that wasn't the only one. A very considerable number of German firms set up in Britain and vice versa. There was a very considerable German community here. We got on very well with them. We got on with them so well that Queen Victoria decided that the Kaiser deserved his place in the sun. Imperial Germany would be allowed to have an empire, but within the influence of the British Empire. And the result is this. Red for British, black for German. This is one of these dreadful 19th century maps that makes Northern Europe look about 5 times bigger than it actually is. Imagine everything outside of Northern Europe being at least twice the size, and it might give you an idea of how big these areas are. Now, as you can see, all of the areas that Germany was allowed to have by the UK are very much within the British sphere of influence. The Germans already, well, German-speaking people probably, I don't know, Hanoverians or Prussians or whatever, already had trading posts established in these areas, but Britain welcomed the establishment of these German-held colonies. Principally in Africa, but also a series of islands in Southeast Asia, a considerable settlement at Shanghai, and very importantly, just there, the German version of Hong Kong, Tsingtao. Tsingtao is a fully fledged naval base. It's very important. Germany now has an empire. Germany is going to start to become dependent on trade. Germany is going to now want to have a navy. Didn't have one up to now. The Prussians only had 7 warships at the time of the Franco-Prussian War, and only 2 of them were seaworthy. So, but under the new auspices of Imperial Germany, that's going to change. Somehow, Bismarck and the Kaiser have got to glue all those disparate states together. Some people say that Bismarck invented the glue which was used to weld them into one, a single nation. I think it might be fairer to say that he stood by whilst that process took place, because the process that took place was the introduction into German society of mass militarism. Militarism to affect every aspect of German life. The purpose of the country was to serve the military. The purpose of the military was to serve the country. Enormous amounts of German money was put into military hardware, including a new navy, and a very, very good, powerful new navy using the latest technology. At first, no real concerns, not by the British or anybody else, but gradually the militarism got further hold. Eventually militarism became pretty much the only real purpose that the country had. If you look at photographs of German families from the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, you'll see all the boys are in sailor suits or soldier suits. And you can just imagine that a young man in Germany would be said, what are you going to do when you grow up? Are you going to be a soldier or a sailor? Those were the only 2 opportunities. This militarism caused Germany to become really potentially an aggressive country. At first, relations with the UK remained good. But it wasn't long before it became fairly obvious that Germany was eventually going to reach boiling point. It began to practice invasions of Russia and France. Ever more regular, ever more frequent mass mobilisations. You may have heard of the Schlieffen Plan, which was the Germans' plan to knock France out in pretty much one go. This was practised over and over again. Whole factories were closed down whilst all the men went to their mobilisation stations and were taken to the front. Eventually it was inevitable that there was going to be a war in Europe concerning Imperial Germany. The country had stoked itself up to such an extent that there really did have to be a conflagration. By the 1890s, Britain was getting very worried about Germany. Germany was now being seen as a potential threat to trade. The German navy was growing and growing and growing. Its size was now beginning not to rival the Royal Navy, it was certainly a danger. So Britain introduced what's known as the Navy Acts. The Navy Acts forced Parliament to vote to the Royal Navy sufficient funds to ensure that the Royal Navy was double the size of the next two largest navies put together. A phenomenal sum of money had to go into the Royal Navy, and the Germans decided to try and keep up, and they pretty much did. The Germans began an almighty rearmament programme for their navy, and by the time of the First World War they were a real threat to the Royal Navy. It was no longer a new start-up nation. This was a large, fully fledged navy with tremendous capability, something to be very worried about. 1914. We all know what happened in 1914. The first thing that Britain does is decide to knock out the German colonies. And the very first shot fired by a British soldier in the First World War was just here, when the Gold Coast Regiment invaded the German colony of Togoland. And the first soldier ever to fire a shot to the British Army in the first... I have to really read it. It's Al-Haji Grunchy. That's right, Al-Haji Grunchy. He went on, in fact, actually, to have a fine military career. By the end of the war, he had the military medal and the Distinguished Conduct Medal for his services here in East Africa. The German colonies, by and large, were all cleared up within about a month. That included all these over here. Australia and New Zealand forces moved into the German possessions down here. Most of them surrendered upon their arrival. Shanghai and Tsingtao were a somewhat different matter. Tsingtao in particular had to be blockaded by the Japanese, another British ally, and it took a very long time for it to fall, and it was a very difficult fight. The Japanese did most of the fighting for us, our troops did get there eventually. However, with Tsingtao blockaded, the German Pacific Squadron is at sea and has nowhere to go. Where can they get their coal? Where can they get their ammunition? They're here. The next nearest German port is here. So they've got a bit of difficulty. The only way that the German Pacific Squadron can get back home is via Cape Horn, and they will hope to coal somewhere on the coast of Chile, because Chile is neutral and there is some German sympathy there as well, even though the country is very heavily economically tied to Britain. Let's have a look at southern Chile, the next stage. Santiago is the principal port. Santiago is a country that is a town that in 1914 was under such a degree of British control that sterling was accepted liberally as the standard currency. To protect its interests there, Britain did have a naval squadron. It wasn't a very big one. It wasn't made up of particularly modern ships, nor very fast ships. Several of them, in fact, were really only armoured transports. As soon as they got word that the Germans were coming to coal at the port of Coronel, the British felt absolutely obliged to attack. And so they did, and they lost. The Germans pretty much routed the British in that. The Germans had much better ships. Poor old Admiral Craddock went down with his ship, and Admiral von Spey arrived at Coronel to take his coal. He came down the gangplank to be met by a young German lady bearing a bouquet. His reply is translated in two ways. One is, "Save it for my grave," and the other one is, "Spare it for my grave," because he knew that having sunk British warships for the first time since 1812, he was going to be having a very, very difficult job to get home. In fact, I'm quite certain that he knew he couldn't make it. And that's why he did something really rather foolhardy. After having coaled, but not having got as much coal as he likes, he makes his way around Cape Horn and he decides to attack the British Naval radio station at Port Stanley. This is not a good idea. He gets to within binocular vision of Port Stanley, and he sees the very distinctive masts of British battle cruisers in the harbour, and he knows that he's had it, because these ships are much faster than his, and they have much bigger guns than he has. The battle cruisers are alerted by a local farmer's wife who's seen the Germans coming, and well, not the battle cruisers, actually. They were alerted afterwards. Firstly, the naval garrison was informed first. She was able to get word to them, because even by 1914 the Falkland Islands had a fully developed telephone system, quite handy for the British on this occasion. The result was the Battle of the Falkland Islands, in which the Germans were all but annihilated by the British battle cruisers. One of the larger German ships tried to escape back round to the other side of Chile. The British traced it and sunk it within neutral waters. Rather naughty, that. The British could probably consider themselves to be satisfied. They had destroyed the German Pacific Squadron, but they'd used an enormous amount of ammunition to do it, and the alarm bells in the Admiralty were beginning to tinkle. Really, it wasn't quite as straightforward as they'd had hoped, and indeed, the Germans had managed to keep firing until they ran out of ammunition, and one of their largest vessels, the Scharnhorst, was probably sunk by scuttling rather than by British action. It wasn't as good as what it looked. Let's have a look at the ships. 1907. This is the ship that changed everything, the ship that changed the world. It's Dreadnought. This ship cost an eye-watering amount of money when she was built at Portsmouth Harbour, Portsmouth Dockyard. She rendered every other warship in the world obsolete the minute that she put to sea. The Germans caught up pretty quickly, though. Almost concurrent with this ship is this one. This is HMS Invincible. This is a battle cruiser. It looks similar to Dreadnought, and it is similarly armed, but the big difference is that it has much less armour. Its hull is thinner. It can't resist the same amount of battery that a battleship would, but on the other hand, it's an awful lot faster. These vessels can do at least 27 knots, and it was this and other ones that went to the Falkland Islands to sink von Spee. And they won purely on speed. This was the idea that battle cruisers would win everything in terms just because they were faster. Here's a later development of the battle cruiser, only a little later. I think this is 1911. This is HMS Lion, another large, lightly armoured but very heavily armed ship. And finally, in 1913, oh no, the development of the 15-inch naval gun. Sorry, the Royal Arsenal strikes again. The 15-inch, the Mark 1 breech-loading 15-inch naval gun, probably one of the finest naval guns ever built in this country or any other, and the two guns outside the Imperial War Museum are examples of this. This enabled the building, or required the building, of an even larger type of warship, one of these, the Queen Elizabeth class, and that is Queen Elizabeth. You compare that from 1913 with Dreadnought just a little before. I'll just pop back to Dreadnought for a minute. There she is. Just a handful of years later. Oops, we've got to that. Tremendous amount of advance. And the Germans had advanced just as fast. So, right, we've had the Battle of the Falklands. Britain's won, but rather disturbingly, not as handsomely as it should have done. On to home waters. Just after the Battle of Coronel, another German commander decides he's going to probe British defences. So he sails down to Great Yarmouth and sees whether he can actually bombard the town. He is passed by various British destroyers, but they can't possibly take him on, he'd have pulverised them. So he got close enough, His shells fell short, so the nearest ones fell on the beach. But nonetheless, he'd proven that British defences weren't impenetrable, and thus a much larger force of German ships sailed from Kiel, just here, through the Kiel Canal and over to Scarborough, Hartlepool and Whitby, which they bombarded, and 147 people were killed. This was regarded as an absolutely disgraceful act in this country because, of course, the people were not military people, they were civilians, and they were defenceless. Britain was utterly determined that nothing like that would ever happen again. And thankfully for the Royal Navy, at about the same time, the Russian Navy had captured a German ship and taken the code books. The code books were handed to the Royal Navy, and from that moment on, they knew where the Germans were going to be, because the Royal Navy could now decode the signals. They decoded the signals that were directing another raiding party to the northeast coast, and the British were waiting for them here at the Battle of the Dogger Bank. At the Battle of the Dogger Bank, the British had a distinct upper hand because they knew where the Germans were going to be. The Germans didn't know that the British were going to be waiting for them. Yet despite having the element of surprise, the British were only able to sink one of the German ships, and all of the British ships were damaged. One of them, HMS Line, which we saw a little while ago, so badly that it had to be towed back to port. And again, the amount of ammunition used was enormous to really get not a great deal of result. The alarm bells are now beginning to ring in the Admiralty quite loudly. Forwards to Jutland, the set piece, the really large battle where the Grand Fleet, the two battle cruiser fleets and the German High Seas Fleet will meet. The battle lasted 3 days, from the end of May to the 2nd of June, and nearly 10,000 people died in that battle. Who won? Well, depends how you read it. I think it's fair to say the Germans did. But that doesn't give the whole story, because by the end of the battle, the British had gained the upper hand, and the Germans had realised it, and they had turned away. It was the Germans who were retreating at this point. The British were getting in advance, and had a decoded radio system, a radio message got to the fleet, it is quite likely that the British might have pulverised the Germans as they made their way back to port. But nonetheless, that didn't happen, and the two navies went back to lick their wounds, and by this time the alarm bells in the Admiralty were ringing very, very loudly. There was something very badly wrong at both the Dogger Bank and at Jutland. I think Mary's got to go.
Yeah, I have, sorry.
You have?
Got to go and fight for the gas holder.
Fight for the gas holder. Good luck.
See you.
One go. See you later. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Right, the Battle of Dogger Bank and the Battle of Jutland. I've got some figures for this, which I think are probably worth reading out. And I think I might have to put my glasses on to do this with these new contact lenses I'm wearing. Can I read it? No. Right, here we go. Right, here we are. Right, the strike rate. At the Battle of Dogger Bank, 1.48% of British shells hit their target. 2.53% of German shells hit their target. At Jutland, 2.7% of the British shells hit their target, and 3.4% of the German shells hit their target. Now, those figures aren't as bad as they sound. They sound ridiculous. In fact, naval gunnery at that time wasn't an absolute science in any real way. A figure of 10% strike rate would have been almost inconceivably good. But nonetheless, the British were nowhere near as good as the Germans were. And there was absolutely there's no excuse for it. Britain had every facility that Germans had. Our guns were as good as theirs, our training was as good as theirs, our morale was as good as theirs, and our ships were probably better. Our guns were somewhat larger and had longer range. What had gone wrong? Well, first thing that had gone wrong was the ammunition from the Royal Arsenal. The Royal Arsenal was using lyddite. Lyddite, otherwise known as trinitrophenol or picric acid, is what's known as an insensitive explosive. When it hits the target, it doesn't automatically blow up. It needs a fuse or an exploder to make it blow up, and if you get that right, it won't do so until the target has been penetrated. The problem with lyddite is that it corrodes the insides of the shells, and the corrosion is a material known as picrates. Picrates is not an insensitive explosive, it is a sensitive explosive, and it explodes upon contact. And the result was that Britain was getting direct hits on German ships. The explosion was happening on the exterior of the hull, and there was no damage being done. Burning off the paint, and that was about it. There was a problem with the ammunition, but the real problem, the really bad problem, was pretty obviously with the gunnery. With the actual aiming of the guns, there was something wrong. Now, the Royal Navy had state-of-the-art equipment to make sure that all of its guns fired at the same time, because just like in Nelson's day, you always want to do a broadside, because that means that a devastating blow will arrive at the target. And to do this, they had these early computers. This one's courtesy of an excellent site on the internet called Project Dreadnought. I hope they don't mind me using it, and just in case they do, we'll move on to the other side, which is certainly not copyright. This is a gunnery computer. This does all sorts of things. It records all the actions that are being taken. Most importantly, it makes sure that all of the guns fire at precisely the same moment, and there are a whole load of other amounts of data that can be put in. It's got multiple electric motors, it's also got hand drive if necessary, and it's all printed, everything it does is printed out on a roll of paper here. Now, these were extraordinarily advanced devices for their day. The Germans had them as well, they were no better than British ones. But they are, and although they're electromechanical, like it or not, they're still a computer. And just like a computer today, if you don't put good data into it, you won't get a good answer. And that was the problem. Britain had not been putting good data into its gunnery tables, as these things are called. We had not been testing our gunnery accurately. And therefore, immediately after the Battle of Jutland, the Admiralty realised that we needed a new gunnery testing station. And if we didn't have it now, we were going to be in trouble. Because they didn't know then that the World War I was going to finish in 1918. It could have gone on for another 10 years. Russia might have allied itself with Germany. Anything could have happened. And all the time that we didn't have complete control of the seas, we did not have control of our security, and we had to have it. So that gunnery testing station was a matter of absolute vitality. By the end of 1916, the Admiralty had acquired all the necessary land, and it really wasn't a particularly difficult decision to decide where it had to be. We'll have a look at where it was now. Shoebury-Ness. Shoebury-Ness Ranges, still in use today. The Royal Arsenal's Royal Gun Factory had been testing weapons in Woolwich and on the Plumstead Marshes. But of course, the range of the weapons got so long that they needed somewhere else. There are written accounts of cannonballs falling on Crossness pumping station, and it is not a very good idea. So, the Royal Gun Factory started to buy up land here about 1852 to 1854, and by 1914, all of this. Now, wherever the Admiralty is going to have this vital gunnery testing station, it's going to have to be somewhere near there or Woolwich. There is no alternative. The reason is that that is where all the expertise is concentrated. There's no point sending it to Wales or the Shetland Islands or wherever, because the people an enormous number of people involved in this, the hundreds or thousands of people necessary, don't live there. And if you move them from Woolwich or Shoebury-Ness, they're not going to be able to do their other tasks. Like it or not, the gunnery testing station has got to be somewhere near here. And there is every reason why it would work well. The reason it would work well was because the Arsenal and the gunnery testing station were in constant communication, in a form of communication that had proven extremely reliable. And we'll look at that form of communication before coming back to Shoebury Ness. And this is it. Gun barges. There were two of them, the Gog and the Magog. This one is quite probably going to the gunnery testing station, in fact. Two little railway trolleys inside the barge, railway lines inside the barge. There are two ways that you can load the barge. You can either lower the gun onto these two trolleys using the crane which the photographer is standing on, or you can take the whole barge up to a hard standing and unfold this ramp at the end, and you can roll onto it a large railway wagon known as a proof sleigh. Let's have a look at that hard standing, which is still there today, the gridiron. This is next to Tripcock Point. It's still there now. It's in remarkably good condition. The barge would come in, be tied up to the quay, which has now disappeared. Rails would be lowered into it, and a proving sleigh would be, with a gun on top of it, would be lowered down using the winch into the barge. That's the first of the Arsenal's proving sleighs, and it's got the 81-ton gun on top of it. This went to Shoebury Ness quite a few times by barge. Plenty of photographs shown of this, no shortage of them at all. And matters started to develop. Here's a picture of proving sleigh number 10 at Shoebury Ness. You can see the unloading process going on. The gun and its carriage is about to be winched up. This whole process became so reliable and so everyday that Shoebury Ness's locomotives and rolling stock were all repaired at Woolwich. They just went on the barge. It was just a long distance version of the Woolwich ferry. That's the Jubilee shot of 1888. That's the one of the proving sleighs there, firing a 12-inch gun. They got 21,800 yards, I believe, out of it, which was a world record at the time. The wagon here, by the way, the proving sleigh, is preserved. It's currently up to Port Nelson in Hampshire, and it is a rather splendid machine as well. And that's what eventually proving sleighs would look like. That's the last one, and that's designed for 16-inch guns. Really quite a tremendous piece of equipment. Very great shame that that one has sadly been scrapped. Well, that's enough of the transport system over to Shoebury Ness, but I can assure you it was reliable. There's just one problem with Shoebury Ness. The maximum range from one end to the other is only 16 miles. That's not long enough. 15-inch guns of the type introduced in about 1913 could already fire over 20 miles on a good day. Now, you could never fire a gun accurately over that distance. Not at all. But the longer the range of the gun, the longer the accurate range of the gun would be. So you still want a very much larger range. You must have it. A gun firing over 25 miles might be accurate, say up to 11, maybe 12 if you were lucky. But a gun of 16 miles might make only 8. So the longer the range, the better. Nobody knows that the war is going to end. Nobody knows that guns aren't going to keep getting ever bigger. They have been for the last 500 years or so. Why stop now? So you need a much longer range than this. Where to put the firing points? Well, in fact, it was absolutely self-selecting. What you need is somewhere that's convenient for Shoebury Ness, somewhere that's convenient for Woolwich, and somewhere that will hopefully give shelter to the barge when it's being docked. As I say, it was self-selecting, and this will show us why. Yantlet Creek. Yantlet Creek can be easily reached by car or train from Woolwich, and it gives shelter to the barge. As long as you can get the barge through the choppy conditions of the estuary, you can guarantee that you'll make a landfall with it. You have reliable transport of guns and personnel and ammunition and projectiles, propellant as well, from a new firing point to the Royal Arsenal, and you can still use the whole of the ranges here. Thus, the new station is to be built here, and the northern part of the Isle of Grain was all purchased by the Admiralty by the end of 1916. Design work started immediately. This is the range as laid out. There's much more to a range than a load of flat sand or whatever. You need observatories, monitoring posts, etc., all of which will be permanent structures. The range has to be carefully laid out. And if you look at Admiralty line maps, you can see these two lines here are known as the Yantlet lines. Between these two lines, that firing from here will go between. And it's worth noting they don't come to a point. They don't come to a point because two firing points were to be provided here at Yantlet Creek. One will be a railway firing point for use with the proof sleighs that we've just seen, and the other one will be a velocity testing site for testing of gun muzzle velocity, which will be a fixed structure. What we're going to do now is we're going to jump out of our satellite, and in the hope that our parachute works, we're going to end up about 100,000 feet above there. So we're going to come right down to this point, and we're going to look up the range like that, from something between 70 and 100,000 feet, and that's what we'll see. That's the sort of that good perspective view of the Yantlet range. Down here at the extreme bottom, you can see Yantlet Creek, and all the way up, right the way up into the North Sea over here. And of course, all the firing would go straight over the shipping lanes. I'm going to take us back for a minute just to prove something to you. This range had another advantage. Two firing points here for velocity and also railway firing, but also very importantly, you could put a battleship here, and you could actually fire the guns from the ship itself up the range. Quite a useful thing to do, and a lot of it was done. HMS Hood in particular was a very regular visitor to this area here to practice firing its guns up the range. We're now going to drop ourselves even further down, but looking in the same direction. We're going to drop ourselves down to immediately above Yantlet Creek, just here. We're actually going to be above the water, and we're going to be looking uprange. In fact, we're going to be looking up this line, that line there. So down we go, and that's what we will see. The tide is out. Here is Yantlet Creek at the bottom, and this is the current view. You're looking at the remains of Yantlet Gunnery Testing Station, but due to undergrowth, there's no way you can tell from this what was actually going on there. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to build Yantlet Gunnery Testing Station, and hopefully I'll take you with me. Here we go. The first thing is I'll bring the tide in. The tide is now in, and we're going to have a dock. The dock makes a nice snug fit for the barges. Still there today, and now rather silted up, I'm afraid, but that's stage number one. But it's not only barges, it's also personnel, particularly the people from Shoebury-Ness. They will want to come by sea. So we have a jetty coming off the end of the dock. We're now going to extend these arms here inland for some way. And we're going to put some extra concrete in. There we are. These concrete arms will now become runways for a Goliath crane, which will run up and down up and down here. The concrete apron in the middle is where we'll have a firing point, a gun mounting in the middle of it, and it's also a useful place for the storage of guns, and also a hard surface for when you lift proof sleighs off onto that and then run them off onto the forthcoming railway. Next, supports for monitoring equipment. Very deeply piled into the ground, and to make sure they don't move apart from one another, bound together by long sections of reinforced concrete. The whole site is piled with 6-inch piles to a very deep level, and there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them, possibly even thousands. It is an exceptionally strong construction. And when you consider that the amount of percussion or recoil from a gun that it's going to have to absorb, this isn't surprising. I think it might well survive the next ice age. Now we put on the firing point. A gun mounting at the end of the concrete, and around it a series of demountable wooden stages so that the gun can be easily loaded with its ammunition. Now the crane rails go on, so that we can put the Goliath crane on here, move it up and down, remove guns from the barge, take it up to here, or a whole series of different operations. The railway arrives. This allows the proof sleighs to be taken off the barges. There is no ramp for them here. The crane will lift the gun off the proof sleigh, set the gun aside. It will then lift the proof sleigh out of the barge, place it on the rails. The gun will then be lifted up, put back on the proof sleigh, and then the locomotive will take it up here and then down there so that it goes to the railway firing point. There is plenty of clear evidence that that system was used quite regularly. But there we are, we've put the Goliath crane on. A large overhead crane, not a travelling gantry crane, but a Goliath crane. I'll explain those in a moment. All we need to do now is see what was put on these blocks. What was the monitoring equipment like? And to demonstrate that, we're going to stand right next door to the gun mounting, on the ground at last, and look straight through between those concrete supports. And we would have seen that. If I take you back to the very first photograph of All Hallows Station, I pointed out some spikes. These are they. The front ones are 110 feet tall, the back ones are 210 feet tall, and they are 250 feet apart. I'll describe these devices in a little while. Here we can see the gun on its mounting and the railway, which goes up there and then back there for the removal of proving sleighs. The crane. There are, to my knowledge, no photographs of the crane in use, and depending on what part of the Ministry's records you read, it could either be a Cow and Sheldon or it could be a Vickers. It could either be electric or it could be steam. I have no idea which one it is, but what we can be certain of is that this is the type of crane that it was. This is a 20-ton Goliath crane. The one at Yantlet was, if it was a Cow and Sheldon, a 200-ton, and if it was a Vickers, a 250-ton. I think 200-ton is more likely, because that's all that was really necessary. Have another look at another slightly larger one of these. Again, a Goliath crane. Imagine we've got little wheels down here so the entire assembly can move up and down the railway line or whatever. Let's go into the Arsenal, and here we can see the travelling gantry crane at the Arsenal. It's not quite the same type. It hasn't got legs. Instead of having legs at either end of it with wheels at the bottom, instead it's running on these runways or gantries. This is the Arsenal's principal gun store. This will be where most of Britain's 15-inch guns are kept. And in the background at the top left, you can see the very large crane that was used to lower them onto the barges. Have a closer look at that just to give you an idea. That's really probably very much like what the installation at Yantlet looked like. A large crane house, 200-ton capacity. This one is a Craven's, but the other one, I think, probably Cow and Sheldon rather than a Vickers actually. Right, on we go. We now have a look at the site in plan view. Here's Yantlet Creek. The barge has arrived. It's sitting in the dock. As you can see, it's quite a snug fit. Here's the travelling crane, the Goliath crane. It comes over the barge, lifts out the gun, takes the gun forward, puts it onto the firing point, the gun mounting, and the gun fires straight through the masts, in between them. Alternatively, it goes through the procedure of moving a proof sleigh, takes out the gun, sets it aside, takes out the sleigh, puts the gun back on the sleigh, and the sleigh goes round like that to get down to the railway firing points. Now a couple of Ministry maps. Very interesting. Probably not too easy to see, I would imagine, on this on this screen. It's a modest railway network, but it certainly did its job. We can see what the various buildings did. Many of these survive. Most important one here is the power station, or electric powerhouse, as it says here. Magazine for propellant, magazine for shells. Splinter-proof shelters at various different points. Splintering from a shell which had burst early, by the way, I should point out. And going to the south of the same plan, barracks, officers' mess, institution and sergeants' mess. And as the railway makes its way down to the 100 of Who branch, the branch to Port Victoria, we can see here the railway firing points. And talking of railway firing points, this is what it looks like today. This is part of it. A couple of concrete walls here, which I assume were the sides of platforms or stages. Now, this photograph comes from the English Heritage Report. I'll confess that right now. I hope they don't mind. And further on, there are some somewhat more important structures which are here. So 4 little white dots with reinforcing ribs coming out of the side of them. I'll put the railway onto this. There we are. The 2 concrete walls that we just saw are there and there, parallel with this line. These are concrete supports for hawsers that would be attached to the front of the proof sleigh and secure it to stop it going backwards under the force of recoil. The railway line here points directly up the Yantlet lines, just like the velocity firing point did. There's no way of knowing when the railway firing point fell out of use, but it certainly was used a lot. There's no doubt about that. On we go to another view, an aerial photograph taken by the RAF just after the Second World War, which 1 shows us what it looks like and 2 proves that it hadn't been destroyed by 1950. Some people think it had gone by then, but it hasn't, and I'll show you another photograph later on to prove that. Everything here that you've seen on the map, as you see, is quite a long structure, very tall masts, in the shadows of the masts. An interesting place to look at. In fact, if you think about the 1920s, in the days when radio had a sort of an almost ethereal or a mystique to it. Imagine seeing what a series of 200-odd foot masts would actually say. It was a very futuristic place to look at that time. Finally, in this little section, a map showing the entire establishment. The railway line here coming all the way down and running into the 100 of Who line here. The BP oil refinery, the Kent oil refinery on the Isle of Grain, is under construction at the moment. The buildings have now got themselves a name, Yantlet Battery, and it states artillery range. At a later date, the Ordnance Survey did actually remove that information, but military sites did sort of tend to come and go on the Ordnance Survey. So that's what it looks like overall. And that's the railway that intrigued me at the beginning. Now, just to go back to this for a minute, I'm going to have a word about how the velocity testing works. These things are called Bashforth screens. And you might think that it's the job of the gunner to aim his gun to fire through them. In fact, it's the other way around. The trajectory of the projectile is set first, and then the screens are moved into position to intercept it. Now, they don't look like screens, they look like frames, but I'll show you now why they are actually screens. That's one of them. It's a wooden framework, see, designed by Francis Bashforth, who happened to be one of the Arsenal's mathematicians. And in 1865, he won £2,000. It's not a bad amount, is it? All these crisscross wires on here are actually very, very fine electrical wires. They're carrying a current. when the gun is fired, the shell will pass through this and it will immediately cut the wires and thus cut the current. A microsecond later or a millisecond later, the shell will pass through the second screen and it will do the same thing. Thus you have two indications of current being cut. You know the distance between the two screens, you know the height distance between the two screens, and thus it's capable to work out the speed of the projectile between the two screens with a very great deal of accuracy. Very, very useful in determining the performance of a gun. Eventually, at Yantlet, it is very likely that they abandoned this system and went over to having lights on one set of masts and photoelectric cells on the other. I can't give you a date for that, but it almost certainly happened because the Arsenal's velocity ranges were doing it, doing that before the outbreak of World War II. How did it work? What did it look like? Well, here we are. It's not a very good photograph, but nonetheless, it's probably worth it. Two very large gun barrels are stored on the concrete apron, no doubt for testing a little later on. Meanwhile, the Royal Engineers are on the wooden staging and they're getting ready for a firing through the masts, but they're not on this occasion doing velocity testing as far as I can see. They're doing quick firing testing. There are at least 23 shells here, and here's a little runway, and there's a man with a ramrod. And what's going to happen is that the shell's going to be put into here, into the breech of the gun, and then the cordite is going to be pushed in, the gun will be fired. And they're going to try and fire it as fast as they can. The reason they're going to do this is because it simulates actual warfare. You want to see how the gun will be affected as it gets hotter and hotter and hotter. And it will get hotter because the temperature of cordite exploding in the breech is momentarily going to reach 2000 degrees. It's going to be a very warming experience for the gun. Is it necessary to issue instructions that after 20 rounds at one every 3 minutes or whatever, you need to alter the elevation of the gun because its performance will alter? The only way you can find out is to do this. Every aspect of gunnery testing was done here. The size and shape of projectiles was honed to perfection here. The makeup and size of cordite charges was honed to perfection here. Every conceivable aspect of naval gunnery was done here. And without it, our ships would not have been effective at war, at sea, and consequently we wouldn't have had our security. It's a very, very important place. This is the gun mounting. I understand that it's a coastal defence mounting, but modified for use here. It's able to slew itself. It's got a degree of traverse. It's also got hydraulics fitted to it, but I think that they were only used for the elevation of the gun. There does not appear to be any recoil mechanism fitted to this. I haven't done sufficient research yet to find out whether it had it. I can see, thinking about it, that it might be worth not having any recoil mechanism, but you know, I'm not yet enough of an expert at gunnery to find out. Let's have a look at the traps who ran it in a moment. Oh no, we won't do that in a minute. Look at this one. This is actually, in my opinion, the best photograph of the place because it sums it up. That's what it actually looks like. Obviously it's not really in black and white, but that desolation and that flatness is that really picks it up for me. You know, it really does. Looks just right. There's the Royal Engineers. The Royal Engineers, they had to live on site. I think there are over 60 of them. I think 63 of them here, including 2 civilians. Yantlet had no cookhouse. All of the food had to come from the barracks, not far from Trattendon. And apparently the only good thing about working at Yantlet was that the food would be tepid when it arrived, because it would remind you about it wasn't quite as cold as the absolutely freezing temperatures everywhere else. Having been there, I can assure you that this is climatically difficult. It really is. The cold out there is just amazing. It goes straight through the bones. But all these photographs we've just seen weren't taken in winter. If we go back to this one and start looking at the shadows being cast, we can work out this is actually taken early on a summer's evening, maybe 6 or 7 o'clock, and they are about to fire at least 23 shells over the River Thames. Now that has consequences. This is what 16-inch guns do to the sea when they are fired. You might notice that you never see photographs of anybody on the deck of a battleship when the guns are being fired. There's a very good reason for it. The concussion would kill them. This sort of thing was going on at Yantlet for year after year after year after year. And sometimes it was going on for hours on end. Such local newspapers as the Southend Standard ran a campaign that went on for ages to try and persuade the ministry to stop working at Yantlet. It was never going to happen. It was just too important an establishment ever to stop. And what's more, for most of its life, the ministry also refused to say when they were going to use it. So there was no way that the hapless villages on the Isle of Grain could open their windows fast enough to avoid the windows being broken. Eventually, the ministry relented, and the people on Grain were eventually informed when the range was going to be in action. But the noise of this place must have been amazing. I mean, I doubt if anybody here has ever heard one of these guns going off. I certainly haven't, but I would think it must be an absolutely tremendous experience to be in anywhere near one of them. Now, we get into the Second World War, and we come to a little warship called HMS Biddyfoot. By this time, Britain's Navy is equipped with guns that have been very, very thoroughly tested at Yantlet. This little ship probably hasn't been, though, because its guns are too small. But it has its place in history. One day it is guarding a convoy coming from Gibraltar to the United Kingdom when an enemy aircraft is spotted some miles away. Some miles away it drops a bomb, and the bomb still hits the ship. What has happened? The bomb is strapped to the underneath of a small rocket-powered aeroplane. Well, there's nothing odd about that in the Second World War. Think of the V1 bomb, the flying bomb that came here in so many numbers. What's different about it was that aeroplane was radio-controlled by the bombardier of the aircraft. And that is why that bomb hit HMS Biddyfoot. It did little damage, but it was the first ship in history to be hit by a guided air-to-surface weapon. 2 or 3 months later, the Italians decide to change allegiance from the Axis to the Allies, and the greater part of their navy sails to surrender to the Royal Navy at Malta. This is one of their 2 greatest vessels, the Italia and the Roma. This is the Roma. It's a very impressive battleship, way outside of the terms of the Washington Naval Treaties that it was supposed to have been built by, same as the Germans. 1 set of drawings for the shipyard, 1 set of drawings for the League of Nations. On its way to Malta, the Roma apparently observed enemy aircraft that it couldn't identify, some miles away. It was in fact the Luftwaffe. And not long afterwards, one of them drops a bomb, and the bomb hits the Roma, but this time with much more serious results than HMS Biddyfoot. It's a devastating blow. Shortly afterwards, another aircraft drops one of these devices. It hits Roma. Roma capsizes almost immediately, or shortly afterwards rather, and because it has a lot of passengers on board, nearly 2,000 people die. It's been hit by this. It's called a Fritz X, and it's the world's first guided missile. In 1943, In 1941, the two great British warships, the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, have been sunk by the Japanese Air Force as they make their way to defend Singapore. The Japanese lost, I think, 4 aircraft. The British lost 2 of their 2 greatest ships. It's pretty obvious by the end of the Second World War that the battleship is dead in the water, if you will pardon the pun. It is obsolete. And if there is no battleship, there is no gun, no ship large enough to accommodate 15 and 16-inch naval guns. There is nothing for Yantlet Gunnery Testing Station to do. At the end of the Second World War, Britain had 2 48,000-ton battleships on the stocks in shipyards. One was going to be called HMS Lion, the other one was going to be called HMS Prince of Wales. To arm them, the Arsenal come up with this. It's very last large heavy gun. It's the Mark III, Mark III breech loading 16-inch gun. They made 2 of them. Both of them were tested very extensively at Yantlet Creek. And they had no ships to be fitted to. The ministry decided to scrap the warships. The project was cancelled, the hulls were cut up, and the guns were cut up shortly afterwards. And thus, these guns were never used. It was the end of the Royal Arsenal as a heavy gun manufacturing facility, because there was no demand for these guns anymore. This, by the way, is a posed publicity photograph. It's one of a series of one of these guns in Royal Arsenal Building D63, known as the Heavy Gun. In fact, the photographs are actually taken mainly for benefit of an American audience. There are a series of them to prove that Britain can do it. These are not members of the Arsenal staff, they are actors. There are another photograph, more telling, taken from one of the gantry cranes that runs up here, looking down on this gun, shows to the left of it a load of armoured fighting vehicle parts, because that's what this building is going to be making from now on. It's not going to be making guns anymore. The Yantlet Gunnery Testing Station has come to the end of its life, and this may well be the very last photograph of it ever taken. It was taken by Aerofilms Limited when they were commissioned by the Anglo-Iranian Petroleum Company, now British Petroleum, to photograph their new oil refinery being built on the Isle of Grain. This represents maybe 1 or 2% of that photograph. It's a tiny little bit out of the top left-hand corner. It was taken in 1951, so we know that it was all there in 1951. The actual date of demolition appears to have escaped, but nonetheless, it would have gone. It wouldn't have lasted any later than 1953. No 2 ways about that. Yantlet Gunnery Testing Station thus closed down, and the land around it, which the Admiralty had bought in 1916, was handed over largely to the Army for use as the Yantlet Demolition Range. Take that back, not the Army, still the Navy. My apologies. There was an enormous amount of ordnance in the River Thames and in the Thames estuary to be removed at the end of the Second World War, and the site of the testing station and its surrounding area spent years being the site of bombs, mines, etc. being exploded in safety, miles from anywhere. In later years, that demolition mainly went over to destroying redundant ammunition and also terrorist devices. That allowed the site to be let out largely to farmers, but it is still a military range. You still can't get in. Do not try it. You run the risk of arrest. I've been lucky. Let's see what's there now. Well, the first thing you see is one of these. In fact, you'll see lots of these. And there are also a lot of these sort of thou shalt not signs with pictures of a pedestrian in the middle of them. There are loads of them. You really aren't supposed to go in. As you come along, you'll come to the checkpoints. You've got to walk through over a mile of military land to get this far, so you've probably already been arrested if you've arrived here. This is the checkpoint, just here, Land Rover, barrier, whatever. This is the police cottages where the range warden lives. Checkpoint there. The range warden and his family and friends, family and his farmer neighbour living here, they live a bucolic lifestyle. At the back is a rather large abandoned creek which has been allowed to flood, and they've got their own little dinghies and they can float around on it, as well as their gardens. Very nice it is. It's the Farmers Officers' Mess down here. That's the former institute behind it. Most of the buildings at Yantlet do survive. Moving up towards the testing station itself, this is the powerhouse, and it gives away actually its age through the way it's constructed. It's made out of concrete blocks. Now they're not quite the same as the concrete blocks that everybody built their front garden walls out of in the 1950s and 60s, but they are quite similar. And the ministry went through a period of really liking these in about 1919 to 1922, something like that, and quite a few of the Arsenal's police houses were built out of them as well. Further down, this is the apron on which guns were stored, and there are the runways down which the gantry crane or the Goliath crane once ran, and in the background where the pylons would once have been. I'm going over to the other side of Yantlet Creek. And taking a bit of a distance, we can see some of the buildings. Here's the powerhouse, just here with its vents on the roof. This is the workshop here, and that little pyramidal roof there is the smithy. And coming along a little further, we come to the jetty, remains of which are still there, and there is the dock. And here's a close-up of the dock taken from the range side of the Yantlet Creek. As you can see, that all the crane rails are still there. There are still a few railway lines around if you look carefully enough. That, except for the towers and the crane and the electronics, it's still pretty much still all there. In fact, it's one of the better preserved little military establishments that there are in this country, because it's not really been used for anything other than farmyard purposes. I'm going to leave you, by going to this photograph, because I think it's the best one taken during the range's operating life, and it will give us an opportunity to move on and see what Yantlet actually really looks like today, which is that. And on that bovine note, I thank you very much for listening to me. That wasn't my best talk, and I'll admit it now. I don't know, I couldn't get into gear, I'm sorry. But it was it's funny, because I did practice it quite a lot this morning, and I just couldn't get the usual gumption into it. I don't know why. But never mind, I hope it wasn't too boring. Yeah. Robin, you've got a question.
I may say one thing, we've known each other a few years. If history could be taught with as much excitement as that, I have personally thoroughly enjoyed it.
Yes. Thank you.
Very well done.
Thank you, Robin. I'll remind that.
Totally,
I'll remember that one.
it's totally, I was captivated.
Good.
If you like that, there's a lot more
Didn't go to sleep?
videos online. Yeah, but Ian Live is...
Yeah, I should point out, by the way, that if as long as I can get a particular copyright permission, because I did show you some photographs that I should have got permission for and didn't, because I forgot to make a phone call this afternoon. If I can get that permission, Steve Peterson has recorded this for his website, RoyalArsenalHistory.com. And that's the best resource you will find about the Royal Arsenal anywhere now. It's better than any of the museums or whatever. And, well, except for Ray Fordham's living room. I thoroughly recommend it to you. It's very good. A tremendous amount of work there. And Steve, well done. You've done a tremendous amount of work on it.
He's got a terrific website. It's really worth watching.
It is, yeah.
Look at it, honestly, on there.
Right.
I'll second that, definitely.
Right. Well, that's good. And there's hardly any questions, so I know I bored you all. So I'll stand down. And there's Robbie's got another one.
How big were the frames with the little wires on? Were those frames 3 metres square?
It's not that big, no. I would say they'd probably be about 4 or 5 foot.
So they have to be obviously bloody accurate to get, pardon my French, accurate to get through the wooden frame.
Yeah, but of course it was the wooden frame that was lined up with the gun, not the other way around.
You still got wind and droop and...
Wind is why I suspect that they were probably quite keen to go over to using photoelectric cells. But I've seen pictures of those velocity tests being done using them, and it's pretty obvious that they were not secured at the bottom. They were just hanging in the air, because when the shell hits them, they fly all over the place. And so no, I think they were probably quite lucky to get a better technology at a later date. But,
and one last question: Do you know of those 23 shells on that summer's evening? How long it took to fire them, or was that a secret you never?
I won't know that, but it would be almost impossible to fire them at the rate of more than one every 2 minutes.
Physically.
Yeah, it's the sheer weight of what's got to be moved, the amount of cordite that's got to be put in. It's reasonably carefully positioned, etc., etc. And I think that even with a big crew, I think that. 1 every 2 minutes would be pretty good going, and in a warship, in battle conditions, there was a real trouble of gun crews actually suffering exhaustion because of the weight of what they were moving into those guns.
And confined space refuel.
Yes, there would have been that as well. Yeah, they would all be wearing flash whatever, but But yeah, it's the weight of manoeuvring, particularly the cordite. I mean, the shells used to normally be put in hydraulically, but the cordite often had to undergo a certain amount of manhandling. And
well, the shell would have weighed about 1 tonne.
yes,
There would have been about 250 pounds of cordite there. That was typical for a 15-inch naval gun.
Oh yeah, it was very hard work. So
it was all inside a turret.
all within the turret. Yeah, absolutely. One thing I didn't say actually was, it's not directly related to this, but one of the ships we saw a little earlier on, HMS Invincible, was sunk by a single German shell landing on top of one of the turrets. There was a cordite fire. The fire spread down into the cordite magazine, and that was it, gone in one go. And it wasn't the only one of the battle cruisers to go like that either. So, back.
Was there any monitoring about where the shells landed at the other end?
Oh, very, very much so. Oh yes, it was really a very, very important thing. In fact, they had people running around on horses. Because not only do they want to know exactly how far the shell had gone, very frequently they also wanted to recover the shell. Because the shell, just like a bullet fired out of a pistol, can be checked forensically to see what the rifling on the shell, the rifling is done to the exterior of the shell, and that's important because it shows you how fast the rifling is wearing out. Most of those big guns only had a life of about 200 rounds, and then the ship had to go back to port to have another one put in. This is what kept the arsenal very busy. It was constantly re-sleeving very large guns. The 16-inch Mark III, that was the last gun I showed you here, had an absolutely exceptional life. It was able to fire something like 250 rounds without any really significant wear. And it's what made it really very, very good. Or one of the things that made it really very good. But
One of the things that was unique about, it still is unique about the Matlin Sands at Shoeburyness, it's unique throughout the world. That's where they do the overwater recovery.
yeah,
And those shells would drop down onto the sand, and at low tide they could go and pick them up.
yes,
That's
yeah.
what Shoeburyness is unique for. it's used today.
Absolutely, yeah. In fact, there is a point I'll make. I'm glad you said that, because obviously you know what you're talking about, and it makes me sound right. So that's quite good. But one point about researching this, the only place you can really go for research, the primary materials are in the Heritage Centre at Shoeburyness Ranges. Now that is open, I think, one afternoon per month. It is 3 or 4 miles from the entrance gate. By the time you have walked there and walked back, you've got about 20 minutes for research. So that is why you didn't see particularly good photographs. It's because I just hadn't had the opportunity to go to the archive. I mean, Kinetic, who run the place now, have been extremely helpful, but they can't really bend the rules for me. So you've been seeing some rather horrible, nasty, compressed, scanned images rather than some nice, crisp ones, which I'm very sorry about, but I think they probably give the idea. But I'm determined one day that I will try and arrange to have a day in the place, and we might be able to do a better presentation.
Was river traffic carried on with the
Yes, continuously.
Broadsides?
Yeah, continuously. The idea was that there would be no interruption to trade at all. The shells were fired directly over the sea lanes, and nothing. To my knowledge, there was never any form of restriction on maritime traffic at all as a result of that, except, of course, that they might have wondered what the bangs were. And of course, it was the bangs that probably caused All Hallows on Sea to fail as a holiday resort, because anybody going there, and a lot of people did go there for day trips, would suddenly have been exposed to these whacking great big explosions, and they go back home and say to their friends, for God's sake, don't go there. It's sort of people blowing things up all the time, and so nobody did go there.
It didn't help, it was called All Hallows on Mud.
Yes. Well, that's actually a fair point.
Clue as to why the people didn't go there.
Yes, it's a fair point. It's not much of a beach, really, is it? It's, I've got some winkles from that at home. I went down there and I thought, what my proof that I've been? So I've got them on the dresser at the moment.
The noise is not so much from the size of the projectile, it's the velocity, the muzzle velocity.
Yes.
And the velocity of those guns was relatively low
Yes,
by modern standards. It was
Yes.
about just over Mark 1.
Mm.
We're now talking about Mark 5 for a high velocity gun.
That's right.
And to some extent, the smaller calibre gun in a tank gun now would create much more noise than the larger gun.
Yes.
The muzzle pressure was relatively low.
One of the tasks carried out at Shoeburyness was actually to physically observe those shells. Because as you say, they were only doing Mach 1. And they were able to actually track them visibly towards the end of their trajectory. One of the reasons why the importance of the observation points through it. Well, any more for any more? Don't think so. I think I can retire for the evening.
We've got a black and white video.
Right, I'm going to retire. One little thing. July this year sees 500 years of the foundation of the Ordnance Wharf at Woolwich, and consequently, which of course led to the construction of the Royal Arsenal. There is the possibility of there being a small exhibition about 500 years of the Royal Arsenal. There is a meeting on the 1st of May, which Steve heard about this morning, and so did I. As a result of that meeting, the venue and everything, and there is finance for this, believe it or not. There is finance for this. I daren't say any more about it at the moment, but it probably is going to happen, but I can't be certain where it's going to happen. So during July and possibly into September, stand by for a Royal Arsenal exhibition.